Up next, we have Tyler Fulton. He's the president of CCA. Tyler Fulton and his wife Darrell own and operate Titan Farms Limited, a 650 cow-calf backgrounding operation south of Birtle, Manitoba. The farm operates about 6,000 acres in prairie pothole country, which consists of mostly tame pasture, hay, and some annual crops. With a degree in agribusiness from the U of M, Tyler has 25 years' experience helping livestock producers manage price risk. He is passionate about advocating for the Canadian cattle industry, especially during these uncertain geopolitical times. Tyler joined the CCA, the Canadian Cattle Association, in 2020 as a board member, and he is currently serving as the president, and he also serves as a director of Manitoba Beef Producers. I know Tyler very well, appreciate his time, effort, and energy that he dedicates to this industry and the time he takes away from his own operations. So without further ado, please welcome Tyler Fulton.
Okay, hi everybody. The introduction pretty much lays out who I am. I'm from Birtle, and because it's top of mind and it's not part of this presentation, I want to take a second to do a quick shout out, maybe one or two people. I'm in this role really advocating on behalf of ranchers and beef farmers across Canada because I can rely on stuff getting done at home. And so my farm manager, Zach, is up here, and he's the guy, really, that I rely on to be able to do what I do on behalf of all of you. So thank you to Zach. I don't get a lot of opportunity for him to be around while I'm speaking, so I wanted to take that. And of course, other quick shout out, Carson and Matthew, Melissa, they are part of my favorite text group. That brings me happiness. So Carson is the general manager of Manitoba Beef Producers, and Matthew is the current president. And of course, Melissa, well, she's staff, but long-standing connections in the beef industry. So here's the kicker. I want to talk about what you want to talk about. And so I have a bunch of slides that I will roll through, but I would prefer if you guys could just immediately just shout out a question or raise a hand, whatever approach you want to do while I'm doing this. Get my attention and we can address it right there. There's honestly just 100 different things that we could chat about. And I only just kind of scratched the surface on some of this presentation. So I'll get started here, and if it kind of picks up, I might reference saying I'm going to get there right away, or just hold that thought, or something like that. But don't hesitate. I'd rather it be like a conversation rather than just me rolling through some slides. Okay. So here we go. So what does CCA do? CCA represents really all beef farmers and ranchers across the country. The way it works is provincial associations feed into Canadian Cattle Association with funds and with members to help, direct the organization's activities. There's 53 cents of every transaction that is destined for our operation. So broadly, we're talking about $3 million budget for specifically kind of the advocacy component. There's other aspects to CCA and different divisions. But those are typically funded through the different mechanisms. So yeah, we take a national perspective. So we're engaging directly with the federal government. We are also very much focused on advocacy in the United States because we rely on that market for about 70% of our exports. So when you export, close to half of your production, and 70% of that half is going to one market, you can understand why it's a priority, and we put a lot of resources into maintaining access, tariff-free access into that market. And it really informs and touches on every aspect that we advocate for. Lastly, just a constant churn of, especially in this geopolitical world that's changing very quickly, is addressing market access issues, making sure that we are doing whatever we can to open up markets that will add value back to the cattle that we all produce. Okay, so priorities right now, I would reference top of the list, maintaining that tariff-free access into the United States. The CUSMA negotiations or review has started with the start of this calendar year, and we have prepared for months in advance of this, and continue to advocate really for no changes to that agreement. Quite simply, there is unanimity in farm groups across not only Canada, but the United States as well, and even in North America, to maintain the agreement the way that it's been operating the last 5 years. And so that's a steady message that we try to echo up to the negotiators and politicians. We advocate on behalf of producers in the realm of business risk management tools. So changes to agri-stability, changes to the use of livestock price insurance, and work to get cost-shared premiums. Those are also within the realm. That's a priority because of the volatile and uncertain times that we live in. Foreign animal disease preparedness. So that's a big thing. But quite simply, we are still informed by our experience from BSE from 2003 and the long hangover that had. Now, BSE was a unique disease that is not, the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is something more along the lines of a foot and mouth disease outbreak. And so we need to be prepared so that we can control and mitigate the effects of that, of an event like that happening. And we'll go into a little bit more detail on that in just a bit. The next thing, trade diversification, as I said, market access, Korea, China, Mexico, UK, and EU. There's so many different barriers, tariff and non-tariff. There's so many different issues that need to get addressed. What I'm really happy to say, and that most of you probably may have heard this already, but we regained access to China really as a result of the latest trip to the Prime Minister, the Ag Minister, Trade Minister, the large federal government contingent sent to China last week. This was something that we've been advocating for years, and quite simply was not grounded in fact. It was based, the excuse was an atypical case in 2001 to remove our access, but really the reality is it was politically motivated, and those are the toughest problems to solve. But we're in a different world, and I am happy to say that we have regained access to that, but let's not lose sight of the fact that we rely on the U.S. market for 70% of our exports. And so that's the bread and butter, that's the ball that we can't take our eye off of. Deregulation. So there's a broad theme from currently this federal government to add competitiveness and productivity, and really their biggest touch point on that is regulation. We have long been advocating for a change in dealing with what we call specified risk material. That's the parts of a cattle carcass that were connected to the transmission of BSE. Quite simply, the U.S. have different rules and different obligations on how to manage that material, and it's a big barrier to growth in our country, and it's a big cost that processors incur. And so we have been advocating for a change that matches the U.S. system and more accurately represents the risk that's connected to that. I'm happy to say that we are making progress, but pulling off regulations is a long-term game, and we're not over the finish line with that yet. Okay. I touched on this already, but really this graph just helps represent how much we rely on that U.S. market. We cannot take it for granted. And so that's going to frame, some of the conversation, that I'm going to focus on here. If you start with that standpoint, that this is what our market relies on, then it's easier to kind of understand why we focus on what we do and the advocacy work that we engage in. So this is another little infographic that reflects not the value that's derived from the U.S. market, but the value by primal cut that's derived from international markets. And it's more than $300 per head. Access to the Chinese market here is complementary to providing, safe, nutritious beef to our domestic consumers, because they demand products and are willing to pay more for products that, quite simply, aren't in demand not strongly in demand here in Canada. And so there's an aspect that needs, there's a principle here that not only does diversification provide, of our markets, provide resilience when there's a shock to one market, the processors can pivot and sell to another, but there's also a benefit from value that we benefit from. And so there too is the motivation behind some of our activities. All right, so this guy obviously throws a wrench into any certainty that we can, that we can expect, or that we used to be able to expect on a daily, weekly, annual basis. Quite simply, it is a different world, and I'd say that he is like the primary reason for it. So starting from the standpoint of our reliance on that U.S. market, I want to talk a little bit about what CCA has done really over the course of the last year to really ensure that we maintain access. So we engage with our counterparts in the U.S., which is the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, in addition with our state-level counterparts, and also directly with U.S. politicians, congressmen, members of the House of Representatives, and senators, as well as farm industry groups, more broad farm industry groups. And we do this to build consensus, to build advocacy groups that are aligned. So what's absolutely critical in this work is that we stay, if we can, aligned with our U.S. counterparts. We want to continue to convey the importance of a two-way open trade that is mutually beneficial and is based on the principle of comparative advantage. That's a lot of economic speak, but it really is rooted in what, it connects with really everything that we're doing in the U.S. So, for example, I'm going to give you some perspective here. I went to Washington, D.C., I think 3 times last year. Each time, very strategic kind of messaging and people that we meet with. In the October visit, what we did is we targeted U.S. members of the House of Representatives that had packing plants in their districts. And we met with them and conveyed to them the current situation in the beef market. The U.S. doesn't currently have access to Mexican cattle because of the New World screwworm. And so we're already at our lowest supply in 50 years. And we've got even tighter because they've lost access to the Mexican cattle. So here's what you need to change, shift your view to, or take attention of. We are at risk of losing packing plants and processing facilities. And so the last thing that we can afford to do is add another barrier of cattle that moves from Canada into the United States. Because if we lose a plant, and it could be one of your plants in your district, that's 3,000 jobs. And so we went and had 8 meetings that were on that message. And actually, within about a month and a half, we lost a packing plant. An announcement came on the Tyson plant in Nebraska. And we met with that congressman. So it's a very compelling, effective message that lands. And it builds a narrative and a view that the hope is aligned with our U.S. counterparts and also obviously furthers our interest. I'm going to keep zipping through here. So some of those meetings include leave behind material. So this is one narrative that we used in an infographic that we were using in one of the earlier meetings to DC that just conveys the actual flow of agricultural goods from the United States to Canada and from Canada back to the United States, but on a per capita basis. So too often there's this kind of zero-sum game in terms of whether or not the total value of the trade from Canada going to the United States is equivalent to the total amount of trade coming from the United States. And it's just that it's not the proper way of thinking about it. It ignores the concept of comparative advantage. And so what we did is we tried to convey, well, while you may think that it is not a balanced trade, in actuality, there's actually a ton of U.S. agricultural goods on a per capita basis that actually dwarfs the amount of agricultural goods that are going from Canada to the U.S. on the same basis. And so for some, that really resonates. For others, this resonates. We see a focus on export development, economic development at the state level, and so those those politicians are very much focused on creating the conditions, the environment that support that. And so when we point out the reliance that their state has, and even their district has, on the Canadian-U.S. trade, it's really another compelling angle for for them to add to the voice, add to the group of those that are advocating to maintain that open trade. Any questions? I've kind of been rambling and going here, but be happy to take any questions as we go. Yeah. No headway. That's been a struggle, but I touched on it actually. So Tanis was referencing she was in Machu Picchu or Peru or whatever on Monday. I was in Ottawa on Monday, and specifically on Monday, it was a high-level kind of start to the next ag policy framework. And what so they were looking for feedback from different commodity groups to know kind of where to go with it. And so there was consensus across commodity groups to allow industry, agriculture, commodity groups to design the risk management products that were best, for their industry, for their sector. But what has always been a barrier from the federal government agreeing to that was that, well, they would respond like, we have these trade obligations that don't allow us to customize by commodity. And so that's why we have agri-stability and these things that every farmer, no matter what you're growing across Canada, have access to. But quite simply, it doesn't allow the right solution to fit the risk that any particular commodity is actually trying to address. And so maybe it's going to be a new world that we can actually have a more receptive audience there. But we've struggled to get that really anywhere to date. This is a perspective. I want to include it just because it's part of that narrative. There's, you get groups, small groups like RCAF in the States that reference, that really want to eliminate that Canadian or Mexican influence on their markets. But what this graph really tells you is that actually, especially in the northern states, they benefit greatly through U.S. cattle being bought up by Canadian buyers and brought up for feeding here in Canada. International advocacy. So there's two ways to, there's work that's being done in, large conferences and stuff like that. I would reference these two reports. I don't know how many would recognize this one. Livestock's Long Shadow. That was a UN-sanctioned report that just absolutely blasted the cattle sector for our carbon footprint, and it set us back a decade. And so if we were there advocating in real time, even tamping down and providing the counter narrative, we wouldn't have lost so much ground. I can say comfortably that we are in a much, much better place now. And so there's not the environmental narrative that there was previously. This is a more recent one. This is Eat Lancet 2.0, which advocates for a significant reduction in red meat consumption, in large part because of the environmental footprint. Not grounded in fact, really ignores the biodiversity outcomes that happen and ignores the kind of the local context which livestock production happens in around the world. And so we've invested in these types of things in order to steer the broader conversation. It's hard to know sometimes whether or not that's good value for money, but if you're not there, then you know that you won't be part of that conversation and you won't be able to steer it. Okay, down to the market access issue. We could talk about Asia, China, UK, and EU challenges. If anybody has any questions specific to those markets, we can chat on that. I talked about China already. We don't want to imperil our access to the US. That's the fine line that the federal government is currently walking. Even though, there's obviously a lot that's happening in the geopolitical space that adds uncertainty. I've focused on some of those broader, like food-focused issues in referencing these two, but it's also really critical to mention the World Organization for Animal Health as being the standard around the world for which so many countries make their rules. There's a ton of work and advocacy and push that is going into, for example, antibiotic resistance and the impact that would have on our sector. And so if we're not there engaging with science, quite simply the narrative takes on a life of its own, and we're dealing with the repercussions, either domestically in our rules that we all have to live within, or export markets that will add further that could be a barrier to to our access. All right, I don't know how many of you in the crowd here have followed the events, social media events of the last really 2 weeks, but it has been a storm. Traceability has become a trigger word for many of us, and so I want to address it as directly as I can and be open and upfront. First off, the goal of traceability from an industry standpoint is, I think, can be narrowed down this simply. In the event of an animal disease outbreak, we need to have a mechanism, a tool, to be able to identify, control the spread and the impact of that event. And there's many different reasons for it. Obviously, animal health and welfare is a big consideration. But what drives our motivation is market access. In the event that we get a foreign animal disease outbreak in Canada, our export markets effectively close. So that 45% that is exported is, it piles up in the country and it absolutely kills our prices, as it did during BSE. Okay, so if you start with that being the risk that you're trying to manage, then what's the mechanism? How can you actually manage that? Well, you put a ton of energy into biosecurity, into ensuring that we defend against the introduction of the disease, obviously. But those, there's always failures there. And so the goal here is to have a system that allows the industry and government to address the situation and control it at the speed that the disease actually spreads. Currently, our traceability system includes, premise IDs, use of tags, massive gaps between when those tags are put in and when they're taken out at the slaughter plant. And so we need to get some control, we need to build a tool that allows us to control that. But here's the kicker. We fully understand that it cannot be on the backs of producers. It cannot be an onerous system that adds cost and adds time and frustration, in the way that maybe some of us have had exposure to currently. And so the vision is that we have a system that is passive, that captures livestock movement explicitly for the purpose of managing those animal disease outbreaks and is confidential and only accessible to government representatives and industry representatives in the event of an animal disease outbreak. That's a critical feature to this thing, that it stays confidential until it's needed. And it's not, and so the critical thing is that it makes it so it's manageable. So there is a discussion, there was an expectation really that we would be seeing some new regulations this spring. You could see the timeline that led to that. Really starting from what we call the cattle implementation plan from 2016 that included really long-standing, long-serving cattlemen and women in 19 different organizations across the country. Got consensus on that, went to government and said, this is the way forward. And by the way, the cattle implementation plan is accessible if you go on if you contact me. I think it's a public document that's available that I would encourage anybody to go through if they really want to dig into it. Moving through this though, we did engage and we want to make sure that we get what we need. But what we need is something that actually works, that actually captures animal movement. But we understand, all of us in this room understand, that if it takes you an hour and a half to report one bull coming into your operation, it's not going to get done. It's just not going to get done. And therefore, it undermines the effectiveness of the tool itself. So we're aligned to find the solutions, technology, but also utilizing agents that can report on your behalf. And what we're talking about is really for cow-calf operations. If most of you would be cow-calf operations, it would be reporting movements in. You would not change anything with respect to when you're selling calves, there's no requirement to report. When you're selling cull cows, there's no requirement to report. It would be when you're moving an animal into your operation, onto your premise, that you would be reporting that animal's animal ID. Okay? This is an infographic that helps, that I think it helps to convey what would be required. I'll single out on the intermediate site, the auction assembly yard. You can see that under reports movement in, they report, it just says group. Well, that's never been super clear to me, but what that means is They don't have to scan. There's no requirement by the regulations as we expect them to report individual animals at that operation. Now, that's not required, but it seems that it might be an opportunity for them to provide a little extra service for those cattle buyers that are moving in those operations. If they don't want to do it and don't want to see a pain, then it seems like a reasonable option to actually consider asking a livestock auction marts to do that reporting. Here's the way to look at it. It's much easier for one individual to report 50 move-ins than it is for 50 individuals to move 50 move-in, like to report 50 move-ins. And I think that's the principle that's been lost in a lot of this social media conversation. But I'm really willing to, take questions and we've got a lot of resources in Melissa and Carson and Matthew, all of which have been bombarded with questions on this stuff. It's okay. You push back, call bullshit. It's with this kind of feedback that we make actually the best way forward. If there's nothing on traceability, I'm going to continue on here. So another thing that blew up just before Christmas, somehow the meat from cloned animals became the hot button issue. Gets stirred up by the food professor, Sylvain Charlebois, that's pretty effective at generating some interest. So here's an interesting thing. Everybody here would probably just step back and say cloned animals. Like that's not a factor, not an issue in the beef sector. Does it have any commercial purpose? Not currently. Does it, may it, will it? Maybe, possibly. But here's a little reality check, guys. The dairy sector, which now is, I think, making up close to 20% of the beef production in Canada, with origins through the dairy sector. The dairy sector, a number of years ago, had a bull, a sire, cloned, for the explicit purpose to increase the volume of semen that it was producing because it was in such high demand. They could not, it was just a perfect specimen, and they needed as much of that semen in order to really capitalize on the market. Well, guess what? There's, the cloned, the offspring of cloned animals is kind of treated as the same way. And so it's already an issue that's upon us, and quite simply is not well grounded in science and fact. And I'll speak to one other thing here. I think the future of the beef industry, with respect to technological developments, is in gene editing. Now, I don't understand the concept, but what I know is that genomic testing and artificial intelligence together represents a revolution, I think, in what's possible in terms of changes to our animals, the speed with which we can introduce desirable traits into the animals. Gene editing, as it's defined, is not introducing traits from other species. It's not that. It's only really effectively conventional breeding, but fast forward so that it doesn't take you 50 years to get an animal that has, this trait, this desirable trait, this polled trait, and this feed efficiency trait all in one animal. And so it's a technology that I think we need to, we need to make sure that it's a tool in the toolbox, because I think it could be a comparative advantage for Canada, especially if we have a mechanism to make sure that those animals can be identified with those traits and maintained through the value chain. It's kind of a broad concept, but these are the types of things that we need to be weighing in on, because the likes of the Ag Critic, for example, from the Bloc Québécois, are advocating for labeling of products that come from cloned animals. It's not practical, it's not feasible, and it quite simply sends the complete wrong message to consumers about the safety of our product. Okay, this was where I was going to mention the livestock price insurance and the advocacy for the cost shared premium, but there's a whole lot more than that. We obviously engage on changes to agri-stability so that we can include more of the costs that are unique to cattle, in particular cow-calf operations, in that program, so that it's more effective. There's also agri-recovery, there's agri-insurance, everything within, that has federal government cost shared for ag programs, that would kind of fall into this, the policy framework. And so that's that kind of ebbs and flows as to when we engage and how we engage on that. Obviously, CCA only has a finite number of resources, and so we got to pick and choose kind of what we engage on, where the battle is. Capital gains tax increases, advocating, for tax law that makes sense for agriculture, cattle. We were engaged on advocating for an increase to the advanced payments program cap to interest-free cap at $250,000, but it just consistently reverts back to $100,000 unless there's a proactive measure by the government to increase it. So lots there, and I mean there's a lot more on that in any sense, but can engage on anything specific that you have an interest in. One last thing that I think I wanted to make mention of, and it's just kind of honestly a metric for the state of how we're perceived across the country. And it's exceptional. It is exceptional how we've seen a big increase in the perception that consumers have of beef farmers across the country. When we originally put this question in the field 12 to 15 years ago, I don't know what the numbers were, but they were abysmal. And it was because they were being fed a narrative that raising cattle was bad for the environment because of carbon emissions. But that has changed, and it's changed because of the work that's being done by lots of different organizations, cattle-specific ones, like the Public and Stakeholder Engagement Group, which is funded through your checkoff, not through CCA 53 cents, but through checkoff dollars. Or the work that BCRC does in actually quantifying the science behind our carbon footprint. It's also all of the provincial associations that work to get the message out. And so what's phenomenal about this is the 2-year increases across the country, especially in Ontario and Quebec, where it's double digit. We are doing a lot of things right. And this is at a time, guys, when we're dealing with record cattle prices. They're not holding it against us. They're increasing the amount that they demand based on really on their perception of what we do. Did you have a question, Rob? Or you were raising your hand? No? Okay. So I just wanted to kind of bring your attention to that. We're getting close to wrapping things up, but I'd love to keep, I think we've got about 10, 15 minutes to just take random questions. I wanted to bring your attention to this. Melissa was key in serving on this committee. The Beef Cattle Code of Practice is a cycle of every 10 years that's reviewed. And this here is an opportunity for you to weigh in on what the new code of practice would look like. The reason why you should do this is because this comment period is typically dominated by animal rights activists. So I encourage you to weigh in on this comment period and speak positively about what's being proposed. And I'm going to volunteer Melissa that if you have specific questions about that she would be more than happy to engage with you on that. Okay, that wraps it up for me, but I really, truly just kind of touched the surface on a lot of stuff. There's a lot of files that we work on, and we just have to kind of pick which direction we want to, where we want to focus. But if you guys have anything at all that you, even issue that you want brought up, don't hesitate. I got a question here, yeah. Yeah, so the question is, what about MCOOL? So mandatory country of origin labeling. So brief history here. Mandatory country of origin labeling was legislated in the U.S. that required packers to label their product as to the country of origin. Canadian Cattle Association dedicated millions to defend against this initiative. It was in place. We fought it at the WTO, at the World Trade Organization, and won. And when we won, we also were given a precedent to say, if this ever comes up again, you can retaliate to $1 billion retaliation without going through our organization, just on a whim. And so we reserve that right to do that. The current status is that it's being kind of reintroduced. The mandatory country of origin labeling, I would say, it doesn't currently look like it's got enough support to really have any legs. But I also want to I also want to kind of reference the fact that $1 billion retaliation ability to respond to the introduction of that is lost in this environment. It doesn't have the same teeth or effect that it did 5 years ago, even a year ago, because of the tariff environment and the uncertainty that's already being tossed around. What is implemented this year is something kind of similar called voluntary product of U.S. labeling. And so it's voluntary. It's honestly something we fought against, but was not successful in ignoring it altogether, or in being able to avoid it altogether. And so I've heard from U.S. packers that they actually that they intend to utilize that label that says, that it came from a U.S. born, raised, slaughtered, processed animal. No break in the chain. That's what it's got to be defined as. And they have to provide evidence that proves that. So the voluntary one does not, I don't think, have a lot of legs, especially in this market where it's such a tight cattle market and packers in the U.S. want to source those animals from anywhere they can possibly get them. That's the current status there. It has raised up in terms of profile, but isn't the front and center issue, I think, that we're dealing with. Any other questions of any type? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. That's a great question. Okay, so I'll address the first thing first, and then the second part second. So sorry, I should probably restate. There was an interest in how much. There was some different graphs that I offered about the flow of feeder cattle over the last recent years, net flow of feeder cattle, and also want a clarification on that, but also who controls or who decides what is actually exported and how does that process work? Where are we involved with that? Is what I'll try to help with. So to address that first question, on a net feeder cattle, for feeder cattle specifically, we actually import more animals than we export. But on a total animal basis of what we produce in Canada, 45% is leaving Canada either on hoof or in reefer vans. Okay? It doesn't include that's not on a net basis, that we're not talking about what's also brought into Canada, because there's beef being brought into Canada as well. But of what we produce, there's like 45% that's destined for export markets. And 70% of that is going to the U.S. So to the latter point, when we talk about market access, when there's deals done on beef, who's actually doing the work? So when there's an agreement in place and a program that's very clear as to how many tons of beef we can ship to a particular country, like Indonesia, for example, CCA engages with the federal government to identify where the opportunities are and priorities are, and why. Why it's a strategic benefit to focus on this market. But at the end of the day, it's the processor and their marketing group that sells the beef. And so we need to work, we consistently work with processors to make sure that we are aligned. We obviously don't want to be advocating to do something that we think makes sense and have the processors ignore it. And so a perfect case in point is this China market access. The market access to China raised we saw it raise its priority when we got feedback from a packer that said, if we can gain access to China for these products that bring far more value there, this is a precursor for us investing in increasing processing capacity in Canada within our plant. And so that's music to our ears, right? We want more competition for that, for those live cattle, for our feedlots, so that the feedlots in turn can pay more for cattle at the cow-calf level. But the whole thing has to kind of, generally make sense. So does that solve your? Yeah. Yeah, no. So to your point about To your point about the disconnect between what's in the best interest of the industry and where, with the goal of diversifying the destinations of our beef, quite simply, it's the highest price that commands where it goes. And it's also, I guess, to some degree, the relationship that the processors have with those meat importers, those beef importers, and finding the price point there. There's an element, I think, to their desire to diversify, but here's a stark reality. Beef, middle meat, like the highest valued cuts that's going from Canada into the US, it could take a 20% hit and it would still not change the economics of it being exported to the US. The US represents that much of a premium over the alternative. Now, that assumes kind of like a static, like nothing else changes. And we know that something's always changing. But that's how much premium those US consumers are willing to pay for that grain-fed beef. And there's no ignoring it. And it's really the reason why we all are benefiting from the best cattle prices that we've ever seen. Okay, perfect. 1 minute late.
That's okay. What I would encourage everybody to do, you'll be around for a little bit, Tyler? Yeah, awesome. So we've got Tyler who's going to be sticking around for a bit. We have Carson Callum here. We have got Matthew Atkinson. Sorry to call you guys out directly, but all are intimately acquainted with both our industry here in Manitoba and representation on our national cattle association. So if you have deep burning questions, definitely take them up to the concourse. They would be happy to address them and have a chat with you. Again, thank you, Tyler, for your time, effort, and energy. We really appreciate it. Ag Days has again elected to, in lieu of speaker gifts, to make a donation on behalf of all of our speakers to the Manitoba Farmer Wellness Program. So a very worthy cause, and we thank our speakers for that and for their time and effort on our program. So thank you so much. Join me in thanking Tyler.